Hi, everyone.
Hello again. We're at the end of Genesis chapter 47, Jacob getting old. And we've only got 5 verses this time, but they're loaded with indicators as to the status of Jacob's faith at this point in his life. So we thought we'd dwell upon something here that we might not pick up on that's connected to that famous Hall of Fame of Faith chapter in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11 of Hebrews, with which we're familiar even when we're witnesses. But we might not notice how much stress is laid upon this passage in the book of Hebrews. So here's the passage.
Verses 27 to 31. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions there, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. When the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "Now, if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place." And he said, "I will do as you have said." Then he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed.
So this insistence on the carrying of his bones remains back to the promised land. What's that about? And I think one thing that perhaps could occur to us, though, is that why is he so insistent about this? Well, it might be faith that has to happen for something else to happen. His remains have to be in the promised land. But there's also the element of, you might even say, doubt or lack of trust in his blood relative, his own son, his favorite son, to do what he says without an oath being taken.
Yeah.
And you reminded me that, didn't Abraham do the same thing?
Yeah. And this was a servant that he obviously did trust. I mean, he gives him the assignment of going and finding a wife for his child. So I think, I don't know if it's a doubt, it could be, but it also might just be the importance of what they're about to say.
Yeah.
So they have them swear an oath. It's like a promise, a covenant. But really, as godly people, we shouldn't have to say an oath.
Yeah.
But in our world, we feel like we do have to.
Yeah, in the fallen world, we all feel like we've got to make sure.
Yeah.
And it looks like Jacob's thinking as Jacob here, as opposed to thinking like Israel.
Yeah.
But Christ raises that bar, doesn't he, in the New Testament, by saying that let your yes mean yes and your no, no. Everything beyond these is from the evil one. Oh, well, obviously that's not the way they think back then. The covenant idea is central to this, though. It's a bond. It's a God-bound oath, sworn by the name of God very frequently, or God says, sworn by myself I swear.
He may also be wanting to emphasize to Joseph the promise that had been made to the family by asking for this to be done, to remind him of their future.
Yeah.
It's not in Egypt, it's somewhere else.
No,
They've already been told they're going to be there only temporarily.
And isn't that the very last point that's made in the book of Genesis, that Joseph is insistent that his bones be carried back to the promised land,
that's right.
Even though he's a naturalized Egyptian by this time. Well, here's the verse in Hebrews that this all connects to. And when you read the Hall of Fame of Faith in Hebrews 11, by faith, Abraham, etc., you perhaps don't notice that only one verse is given to Jacob. And it's amazing what it says. It says, by faith Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. Well, that is about the next chapter, 48, where he has Manasseh and Ephraim, the two sons of Joseph, in front of him. But this bowing down in worship over the head of his staff is a reference to what we just read.
Mm-hmm.
But what does it read in the Hebrew again?
It said, bowed himself on the head of the bed.
Well, this brings up a very big point if you're a Jehovah's Witness. What's the Bible that the writer of Hebrews is using? It's the Greek version that says leaned on or bowed down and leaned upon the head of his staff.
Yeah.
He's not quoting from the
This
Hebrew.
would be the Hebrew.
And what's the relevance of that for Jehovah's Witnesses? Well, you insist that the name of Jehovah is everywhere in the Hebrew, which it is.
Yeah.
But you don't realize that it's nowhere in most copies of the Septuagint. Judging by the quotations in the New Testament, it's nowhere, because they never once quote the Tetragrammaton from the Septuagint, which the writers of the New Testament are quoting from about 90% of the time, 80 to 90% of the time, depending on which book. So that's the kind of point that makes all the difference to your exclusive claim if you're Jehovah's Witnesses. The
And
Bible they're using is not
That's right.
the Hebrew.
Yeah, that they're using the Septuagint at the time.
So they won't see Jehovah's name everywhere like you do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think we've got I wanted to read the rest of it, though, just about the resurrection point.
Yeah.
Because if you read back to verse 17 in Hebrews 11, you have, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. Notice that, only son, despite his secondborn, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. And then he says, by faith Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith Jacob, when dying, blessed each of his sons. So he gives one verse to Jacob and one verse to Isaac, and the rest is about Abraham. But it's all to make the point that they all had the same faith, that somehow the future depended on the land and the resurrection
and the hope of a resurrection
of the body.
Yes.
And why is that important?
Yeah. So, as witnesses, we don't make a big deal of the fact that Jesus was bodily resurrected. We don't really believe that as witnesses. We have him, spirit.
And recreated in essence, right?
But when you read through the New Testament, they keep making a point of the fact that it's an empty tomb and that they see him bodily, that they can feel and touch him.
And the body's got even the holes caused by the nails.
Yeah,
in it.
so they are emphasizing the bodily resurrection of Christ.
Yeah.
And we don't do that. And even when we think of of the future, when we think of people being resurrected, we don't believe they are resurrected in the body, the bones that they had in the past. We have them recreated.
Yeah. So Jesus, even before he dies, makes much of the fact that the tombs will open.
Mm-hmm.
And what difference does that make from the Jehovah's Witness perspective?
Yeah.
So you have the empty tomb being stressed in all four of the Gospels. You have the reports of the appearances after that, stressing that his body has continuity with the body that died.
Yeah.
And what do you do with all of this? And you might say, well, that's just theology. But the truth is, it's the gospel. It's not just theology. This is the gospel of Paul and the gospel of John.
They all emphasize not just his death and his resurrection, but they all point to the burial as well.
Yeah.
So why do they do that if it's not important?
Barnhouse has a good quote, though, right?
Okay.
Before we give you the links, which are two important videos that we've done that have to do with the gospel and the resurrection.
So Barnhouse said, in the New Testament record of the Old Testament men of faith, God took from the life of each the salient feature which characterized him as a man of faith. There are many surprises, but the record of Jacob is the most surprising of all. God selected one incident in this deathbed scene as that which pleased him most in Jacob's life. Lord, may we obey thee in things that seem little to us. So that he's referring to the Hebrews text, right?
Yeah. Would we pick this one verse at the end of chapter 47 as the key event
In his
to
life.
remark in his life, that he had faith at the end, that indeed there was a future, and it involved the promised land and a physical resurrection.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And
So why they wanted to be buried in that place, not just because if he was buried in Egypt, wouldn't he still get a resurrection? No, he wanted to be buried in the promised land because the land was also important.
amen.
Yeah.
And what's our link again? It is
JW's good news is not John and Paul's gospel. Their gospel is Christ's death, burial, and bodily resurrection.
see you next time.